Very special thanks to Philip Raby Specialist Cars for providing the Mercedes AMG in this review, and for any of you who have followed the Beards and Cars series, you will doubtless have seen other episodes wherein they provided cars for me to talk about. Now, for me, it's an easy recommendation to put their link to the website down in the description because their cars are clearly hand-picked, they're specifically picked, they have a love for what they do, and that's the exact kind of dealership I like to work with. So if you are looking for something that is a bit more special, sometimes a bit rarer too, especially in the case of Porsches and classics, then of course give them a look down below. Simply put, the SLK55 is a car that I've always wanted to review in this series. There's something just inherently appealing to me about this concept of almost a modern-day Shelby Cobra, more so than the SL, in fact, wherein you take this small, completely unthreatening, almost pretty little sports car, the SLK, and then just drop this ridiculously oversized AMG V8 engine in there, which could very easily go wrong. And even though it's not a case of going wrong, consider for an example of what I'm talking about, the SLK55 AMG. I also reviewed that, of course, with Philip Raby some months ago on the channel, and that is this car's big brother. Massive V12, an insane amount of torque, and even with a 5-speed gearbox, much higher curb weight of around 2 tons, which should really ground you, it's still easily the lariest car I've ever driven. I've driven cars that were far faster, cars that were far more powerful, but they didn't feel anywhere near as vicious as you could tell that SL65 wanted to be. Even with ESP, traction control, ABS, it felt like it was just a TVR hiding underneath. And for some people that's great, but not necessarily for the kind of people who would probably buy an SL. Sure, they want performance, but they're probably expecting something a bit more poised than that car actually is. That, to me, is the biggest strength of this car. This is such a composed, controlled, confidence-inspiring vehicle that I think if you are a fan of it and you finally do get the chance to drive it as I was, I think it will be every bit as good as you're hoping it will be. Now, the problem that some people have had with this, including, for example, Evo magazine, is twofold. One is the gearbox, which we'll talk about in a second, and two is the electronic safety systems, ESP, traction control, all those kind of things which AMG were notorious for their cars never actually being able to fully turn off. I would argue, though, that I disagree about that being a problem, because you've got to remember this is not a TVR, and it's not trying to be. Yes, it has a very large, very powerful, extremely torquey engine, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wants to be a ballistic, track day focused sports car that is designed to rip your head off. Quite the contrary, AMG and Mercedes know their customer base. They're customers who aren't going to drive a car like that because, let's say it as it is, for £50,000, if those customers wanted that, they would just buy a TVR. They'd buy whatever other car that does offer that kind of experience. The whole point of this car is that it does keep you safe. It allows you to skirt the edge of having that torquey, overpowered, in a very small frame kind of appeal, but without feeling like you're about to die all the time. It's a different approach to a sports car, and I don't think there is anything wrong with that. I think it's actually great to have different approaches. There are so many sports cars that already cater to the living on the edge mentality. Why not try something different? Now, with that in mind, one thing that cannot be denied is that this is not a slow car. In fact, it wipes the floor with most other sports cars of the time, including the Porsche Boxster. Even on paper, this was one of the quickest sports cars around, and it was produced incidentally in this form from around 2004 to around 2011, with a facelift in there around 2008. 4.9 seconds is the quoted 0 to 60. Of course, it's speed limited to 155. The black edition raised that to 175, but Car and Driver took one of these and hit 60 miles per hour in 4.3 seconds. That is a hell of a lot faster than quoted, and means that, especially for its age, this is a properly fast little car. So say what you will about those safety systems, it ain't slow, that's for sure. And one of the things that I really like about the car, completely unsurprisingly for that AMG engine, is the power delivery. In particular, the torque delivery. The torque hits its peak at 4,000 RPM. Incidentally, peak power is at 5750. So it's not this crazy high revving racing V8, of course not, but the torque isn't super low. The engine likes to be worked, but it doesn't make you push it too far before it gives you the reward. It's that mid-range kind of torque, which is where you want to be in a sports car, keeping up those high average speeds through corners, but at the same time not necessarily needing to work the gearbox too much because you've always got that torque. It just gives you that shove, or in the case of this car, that relentless rolling on of acceleration, which even with the electronic aids feels like it kind of wants to break loose a lot. To me, that's kind of a perfect approach to a sports car, or at the very least a modern sports car, because of course none of them are ever going to be as raw as something like a Cobra was back in the 60s. Now, with all of that being said, the car isn't without its amenities, and that, to me, also highlights the point that I was making earlier on about this being a different kind of extreme sports car. Yes, it is muscular, it's a bruiser, it sounds the part, looks the part, has the power, has the torque, has the sheer bragging rights engine size, and of course it has the legendary name of AMG attached. But it also has those comfort features. It even has a very nice little feature which Mercedes themselves call the air scarf, a heater essentially behind your head in the headrest of the seat, which keeps your neck warm even with the roof down. It's not something which most sports car owners who are looking for a TVR are necessarily going to want. As I said, it's a different kind of car for a different kind of buyer. It also has a very nicely operating folding roof. Gets up and down in about 22 seconds, which is quicker than the previous car, and incidentally these are bigger than the outgoing model. They're longer wheelbase as well, wider, taller, but also more aerodynamic, and of course the weight is much higher as well, but as I've already alluded to, that increase in weight is very well utilised. In fact, I believe that the overall feeling of confidence that this car gives you is easily its strongest point, with the engine being its second strongest point. The car feels so well balanced to the point of being almost, in my opinion at least, better than a mid-engine sports car would be. I've driven a few mid-engine cars at this point, and I'm never a huge fan of how vague they can sometimes feel. Sure, they can be extremely quick, and they are very popular, so I'm sure it's me that's the outlier, but front engine, even front mid, to me just feels more composed. You can tell more what a car like that is going to try and do, be it step the tail out, overcook a corner, whatever the case may be. In the case of this car, the weight is so nicely placed within that frame, and it feels like it really is displaced throughout its entire length and width really, really nicely. It's a lovely car in terms of balance. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, these cars were about £50,000 when new, so what are you going to pay these days? Well, actually, that's one of the crazy things. These are very reasonably priced cars, and I would actually say they are potentially a better deal than most SLs of this era. Of course, the SL being the R230 shape from this time, still a very pretty car. I believe Top Gear magazine called it one of the prettiest cars around, justifiably so. You can even buy an SLK55 AMG for a similar kind of price to one of these. Now that one has the same size engine, but considerably more power, around 100 horses more, but it's also carrying a lot more weight, it's a much larger car, and has much more of the overt long-distance approach. The reason why I think this is actually a better option is because this car has performance which feels more playful, more usable, certainly through tight, twisty corners, and it's also a car which you could almost just use every day if you wanted to. The fuel economy, although thirstier than some, is quite livable, I would say, and as long as your space requirements aren't crazy, you know, for example, the boot space is good enough most of the time for a sports car. The interior certainly has enough space to not be uncomfortable or too cramped, unless you're, say, over 6'7" or something like that. For me, for example, there's more than enough space to drive it comfortably, and it's that kind of comfort level, that kind of safety, that kind of kit, which even allows that to be a discussion. Some people, sure, will use a Cobra or a TVR or a Porsche Boxster, whatever, as a daily driver, but that's a choice you really have to think about. because you do lose certain amenities. A car like this, it's barely even a decision. Of course you can use it every day, it's a Mercedes. But to get back to the point of pricing now, at least here in the UK, and of course this will vary quite a bit depending on where you are in the world, you're looking at anywhere between just under £14,000 and feasibly up around £24,000-25,000 for a really, really low mileage car. And as far as the Black Edition, which of course increases the power to just under 400, increases the torque, increases the speed limiter, drops the acceleration, etc., well, all bets are off for one of those for obvious reasons, but for these, as I said, the pricing is very reasonable. 14 to 17,000 is the kind of region that you'll typically be looking at, and for that, the mileage isn't bad, 50-60,000 miles, which for a car with this kind of lazy approach to an engine with all torque, that kind of mileage is nothing. This engine takes that in its stride. But to speak to that second point, for which this car does sometimes get critique, that being the gearbox, it's a 7-speed in the case of this car with paddles behind the wheel, and more typically you'd have expected maybe the 5-speed that Mercedes like to use quite often in these cars. The SLR McLaren even had it. Of course, the SL65 that I drove had it. I believe the SL55 shares it as well. And one of the reasons why they have those great 5-speeds is because they have so much torque that you just don't need a lot of gears, which is kind of why it's curious that this one opted for a 7. Now, the interesting thing about the Black Edition, at least from my research, it indicated that you could spec the Black Edition with a 5-speed. So if you do perhaps prefer that gearbox, that might be the car for you, of course if your funds are a lot higher and if you can even find one. However, for these ones, 7 is the way it goes, and in my opinion it's a gearbox wherein most of the critique that it gets is only going to apply to the kind of buyer who is going to try and turn off all safety systems, put it into complete flappy paddle, manual mode, and use it in that way, and try to push this car to the edge at any given moment. Some owners will do that. In fact, maybe many owners will do that. I would actually argue, though, a lot less owners than you would think are ever going to do that, because most people who want to floor it in a car like this, they're just going to put the foot down and let the gearbox do the work, because that's kind of the point of an automatic, 9 times out of 10. I personally found in my experience with the car that the gearbox was perfectly adequate. It's smooth, it was barely noticeable working through the gears, and as I said, there's so much torque, it barely even feels like you need 7 speeds to begin with. The criticism is fair though. From what I've heard, some people don't like, such as again Evo Magazine, that the gearbox, when using the paddles, takes a little bit too long to change up and down through the gears, which can kind of throw off your racing line. But again, that kind of highlights the point. Racing line. How many people are actually going to be using a racing line on the street? I just think it's an issue which, although true, doesn't have anywhere near as much validity in the real world 98% of the time as some journalists may lead you to believe. I believe that this car is perfectly capable at what it does best, which is being a surprisingly civilized, extremely torquey, very pleasant and lovely experience. From almost a car that blends two worlds really nicely. It has the size advantage, the fun factor, the small, chunky, ball of power bulldog approach that a sports car has, usually as an advantage over a GT car, but with the more long distance feel, the smoother approach, the more civilized, relaxed and safe feeling that a big GT like a Jag may give you rolled into one. In fact, somewhat ironically, this SLK55 feels more like a smooth GT car than the SL65 did, which to me is kind of surprising, given that the roles should be completely reversed. Some people may not like that, but I think more people may actually love this car if they give it a chance, because it does have a certain image that tends to be the lower models, a little bit of a cute car, a little bit of maybe a hairdresser's car in the vein of an Audi TT. I would encourage you to put those thoughts to one side, try the AMG if nothing else, because this car actually has a lot more to offer, especially once again for that say £14,000 to £17,000 price range, because you really can get a lovely example even within that. These are cars which are so unique on the market, being essentially a muscle sports car. I think it's actually a pretty cool concept, and one which, especially for the Chrysler era of Mercedes, they pulled off pretty damn well. It could have easily gone very wrong, as many AMGs are a bit patchy from that time, but this, in my opinion, is one of the good ones. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the SLK55. If you are an owner of one of these, if you've still got one, if you're just a fan, of course drop your thoughts down below, maybe something which you may disagree with, something you'd like to add, or maybe even cautions, concerns, or things to expect for other potential owners who are watching the review. And of course, if you want to check out the other reviews that I mentioned, you can click the little eye at the top of the screen, or just click through here to the playlist for Beards and Cars. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.